This is the Mass Effect HYPEcast, episode number 10. I'm your host, Morgan, aka Bon Diesel. And this is a podcast about Mass Effect, the future of BioWare's premier franchise, and all of our speculation and ideas for the next game. It's been an interesting year if you're a Mass Effect fan like myself, who's looking forward to the next game, but really more than anything right now, just looking forward to news about the next game, because it's been pretty sparse, at least anything real. We've had a decent amount of things. Some of them we'll talk about today. Articles about BioWare, things that are actually happening, layoffs, announcements, and so on. But actual news has been pretty sparse, and I'm honestly pretty surprised. I thought with the, I believe it was with BioWare's like 25th anniversary earlier this year, they were kind of in the aftermath of Dragon Age of the Veilguard. They're making all these moves that we found out about, one way or the other. I thought by now we would get something, a full production announcement or just a status update on the next game. I really didn't think it would be until N7 Day before we get anything, but it probably will be, and we'll talk more about that later. I don't necessarily think it's bad or good or whatever. It seems like we're looking at a studio in transition, trying to survive, with a publisher who seems to be trying to keep them alive, even if, some of the things we talk about or some of the things we've heard make that hard to believe or whatever for some people. I just think it's a weird time, and I can't imagine what it's like internally. With all these changes, all these people coming and going, they're hiring, but they're also downsizing, and they're going from a studio that used to make 5 or 6 games at a time to a studio that's basically going to make 1 game at a time, as far as we know. A studio that is just in transition, right? And with a franchise that its last entry, wasn't the biggest deal in the world. I think is maybe a bit underrated, but is probably also to some properly rated. Living off a studio that's living off the fanfare and the reputation of a trilogy of games that came out almost 20 years ago. It's the first one. So I think it's interesting. I think my outlook on it is different than many like diehard long-term fans as well, because I'm new to the franchise. I only got into Mass Effect in 2021 when I played the Legendary Edition and started making content in this podcast and stuff like that, where other people have been involved for 20 years or almost. And they've gone through the trials and tribulations of the original trilogy coming out, and the reaction to the third game, and then the wait for the next game, which was Andromeda and didn't really go that well, and now the wait for the next game, which is kind of wild to think that in the best case scenario it's going to be a decade between Andromeda and the next game, and I don't think that's going to happen. I think at this point, unless we find out this year that they're in full production and they have, the scale of the game or whatever is, possible to make in like a year, 2 years, maybe EA might push something like that. We'll have to wait and see. It very likely will end up being more than a decade between those games, which we'll talk a bit about, because I think that can be a problem, because it definitely was for another game BioWare recently put out. But I do see evidence that they're trying to not have the same situation. So we'll get into that here in a little bit. But overall, obviously, I wish we had more info. I genuinely thought we would get something. The Summer Game Fest, Xbox Showcase, all that stuff is passed, and we didn't get an EA Play or anything, and they didn't really seem to appear at any of the shows, not even with Skate or any of the, not even with Battlefield or anything, which we're finding out the next game will get some kind of announcement here soon. EA seems like they're kind of keeping their head down, working on the next Jedi game, working on the next Mass Effect, working on all their sports games like they always do, next Battlefield, all that. But no news, nothing big at least for Mass Effect yet, and we may be waiting a bit longer. Okay, so let's jump into some of the topics I wanted to talk about this episode. First, we have the Jason Schreier article from Bloomberg that came out. I'm recording this on June 17th. This came out the week before while I was on vacation. I've litigated this significantly. I made a big post on social media. I made a video only about this article that just came out. And I also talked about it during the podcast on the bonfire. So I'm not going to relitigate every single detail of all of this. Basically, it was a big article about BioWare, about the development of Dragon Age: The Veilguard, kind of some of the good and mostly the bad things that happened, some thoughts about, or some, insight about why the game didn't sell as well as EA definitely wanted it to. Even though it was generally enjoyed by a lot of people and reviewed pretty well. And then finally, just a little bit about Mass Effect. So I only want to talk about the Mass Effect direct stuff that was kind of mentioned or insinuated, or the things from the article that will impact Mass Effect. If you want my full thoughts on everything, check out my YouTube. There's a video just about the article. Check out my last Bonfire, the Bonfire Gaming Podcast, where I talked quite a bit about it, or check out my social media where I chirped about it a bit. Let's talk about Mass Effect, though. So I think the main thing to talk about with Mass Effect that I thought was kind of interesting about this article was how it talks about, mostly this whole article was things that we pretty much already knew, but it had some more detail and some more internal insight, it seems. So we all knew, if you're listening to this podcast, I have to assume that that we found out last year that the Mass Effect team basically didn't work on pre-production of the next Mass Effect game for like a year, if not a bit more. So I believe it was late 2024 or late 2023 into basically the release of Dragon Age: The Veilguard, which was roughly a year. They were pulled from pre-production on Mass Effect and thrown at the Veilguard to help it ship. Now, my impression, my assumption, I guess, when we found this out, because we kind of knew while things were happening that this was going on, I was under the assumption they were in there as support roles. But if you read this article, that is not the impression that we get. We get the impression that they were very much there to help with leadership and to ship the game, and that the way it actually played out was they, for lack of a better term, at least according to this article, just took over the game from the leadership team of the Dragon Age team. There's a lot of reasons that this kind of makes sense. There were things like the final act of the game is basically Dragon Age's version of the suicide mission in Mass Effect 2, where this final act is based on decisions you made and the loyalty missions you completed and choices you make during the final act. You have characters that can die, that can get, kind of disappeared from your party for a bit. And then the ending is kind of, dependent on what you did throughout the game and the choices you made, the available endings you have. So it was very much like the suicide mission from Mass Effect 2. And it's not all that surprising that it seems likely the Mass Effect team is the one who probably, made that happen. Some of the article was talking about how there was a lot of conflict and almost kind of the article implies that it was almost a talking down to, or kind of like a snobbiness from the Mass Effect team when they were checking out what Dragon Age the Veilguard looked like and what that team had done so far with some of the writing of the game and kind of the snarky tone and stuff that has been discussed all too much, as we all know. If you're, I assume if you're listening to this, you've seen all the drama and stuff. But It was interesting that apparently there were a lot of like editing of the story and rewrites, even though rewrites couldn't really happen because the voice actors couldn't record, because this was during when the SAG after voice actor uh, protests began, and they weren't working with any of the real big companies like EA and Activision. That actually just resolved, or is getting resolved as I record this right now. They're just finally now getting some kind of agreement together. So it was interesting because the tone of the article to me was like kind of a hit piece, at least in my opinion. You can disagree, I'm sure Jason would, but it just felt like he was framing everything in the worst possible light to make everyone look as bad as possible. There was a lot of mentioning in there of how there's always been kind of a rivalry between the Dragon Age developers and the Mass Effect developers, where in some other studios, that the teams kind of move in between each other, and while they focus on one game, everyone goes there, and then they move around. The history of BioWare has very much been these kind of separate teams making multiple games at once. And it seems like, and I've seen this in other places as well, that there's definitely, especially in the direction of animosity from the Dragon Age team towards the Mass Effect team, with this impression or feeling that the Dragon Age team kind of gets thrown under the bus. They don't get all the same resources, they don't get all of the same freedom and stuff like that the Mass Effect team does. The funny thing about the article, if you've listened to me enough, you'll roll your eyes here because you've heard it too many times. Of course, Jason Schreier quoted David Gator here. David Gator hasn't been at BioWare in I think it's over a decade at this point. He has his own studio that supposedly is making and releasing games. But man, you would think that this dude left BioWare yesterday, and he is real mad about it, because anytime he comes up at this point, or at least for the last few years, it's been the crap on BioWare. And let me be clear. The things he said, the things he's alleged, all this stuff, it's all probably fair, and it's his opinion. He obviously is entitled to that. But it is just, it's strange to me that, whenever you see him quoted in articles, always about BioWare, you would think he got laid off yesterday and not that he quit on his own accord 10 years ago. Regardless, he was in this article and he was kind of shoring up this idea of Mass Effect team always gets what they want. He was implying that's what happened with Veilguard. In theory, he wouldn't really know that, but he would. I mean, he still knows people there, I'm sure. He's still so obsessed with, with that studio. I have no doubt in my mind he, interacts with people there pretty often, at the very least, to just maybe complain to them about the place they still work. I don't know. But there was just this big kind of mood in this article of like, man, the Dragon Age team kind of got thrown under the bus. The Mass Effect team came in, took over everything. And I guess, I don't have a ton of loyalty to a lot of these devs and a lot of the studio and stuff, because I'm fairly new to the fandom. Obviously, people who have been around for 20 plus years, feel different than me. So, don't let anything I say for the rest of this little segment, upset you too much. I'm just coming from a different angle. But it kind of seems like the Mass Effect team may have done things that took this from a game that was going to be like kind of bad to a game that's like pretty good. And a lot of the things that it sounds like the Mass Effect team kind of scoffed at, that seems like it, and likely it kind of offended the Dragon Age team. There was a lot of accusations in the article of, basically a feeling that the Dragon Age leadership had kind of failed and had kind of made this kind of amateurish work, and had kind of spun their wheels. I mean, the things mentioned there are things that ended up being kind of the weaknesses of the game, the things that it sounds like the Mass Effect team didn't like, and that the Dragon Age team was being stubborn about, were some of the things that kind of weren't great. And it's definitely not an I told you so thing. These people know what they're doing. Maybe none of this stuff is true. Who knows? But it's also hard to blame them, right? Because, in this article as well, we found out that we've known this for a long time, that the Dragon Age game, that eventually became the Veilguard was rebooted multiple times. It had, at one point it was supposed to be a multiplayer game. Another time it was supposed to be a co-op. And then, in the last couple of years of development, EA finally relented and let them just make a single player game, but didn't let them basically stop and start from scratch again because they'd already blown too much money. They needed to put a product out, which led to them, for all intents and purposes, making Dragon Age the Veilguard in like 2 years. From the time that they got like the final go to make the type of game it became to it coming out. That kind of goes against some of the previous reporting that we found out. And this was obviously a big chunk of when the Mass Effect team was involved. But initially it was like, oh, well, EA wanted the game in 2023, but they let them wait until 2024. Well, now in hindsight, we realize that, EA initially wanting the Veilguard in 2023 means that they wanted them to release a game in like a year of like full production, full vision, knowing what they were doing. So towards the end of the article, it talks about how that BioWare's had layoffs. It's had they moved a lot of people to other studios. At first that was temporary, and then it became permanent, and that was kind of a big deal. It took the studio from being a 400 to 500 person studio, and now it's assumed they may be as small as 100 people there, and that they are working on pre-production of the next Mass Effect, which is good. Like, that's a good thing. If you want another Mass Effect game, if you want BioWare to survive, those are all good things. Obviously them, doing all these layoffs and stuff like that, it includes like most of the historical narrative people who were there. I'm so torn on this because you never want to let like good veteran talent go. People have been around, people who wrote some of the most iconic characters for all of the franchises, right? But then at the same time, these were the people who did the things that were, of all the reasonable criticism of Dragon Age the Veilguard, the writing was probably the most prominent one. And I don't like the decision that EA/BioWare made, but it kind of makes sense what they did, even if it sucks, right? And then if you look at this leadership issue with the Mass Effect team, well, look at the people that were being interviewed for the next Mass Effect or for Dragon Age the Veilguard. The 3 or 4 people I remember being interviewed pretty often for the game I don't think any of them are still at EA, and they're definitely not at BioWare. I think John Epler is still technically at EA, but he's on like the skate team or something now. So obviously they did some cleaning house there, and while that seems like it's in big part them paring down the studio to being like a one game studio, it also seems like it's probably a result of, if you want to call it the failure of Dragon Age the Veilguard. It's weird. It's weird times. We know, the studio is big enough right now to be doing what we know it's doing, to do pre-production on a game. If they have a few dozen, 50 to 100 employees, that makes sense. We are under the impression they're scaling up. We'll talk about hiring in a bit, but even someone like Mark Dara, who is doing kind of a retrospective on this stuff, talked about how it's, in the comments of one of his videos of saying like, yeah, it looks like BioWare staffing back up to start making another game. And that's kind of the pattern. That's how these things go. So the article, I had tons of issues with it. I thought it was pretty amateur considering the author, but it also seems like the author, who is a human and also can be a bit pretentious and a bit bullheaded, seems like they may have an issue with BioWare, or they just know it's a good thing to go after if they want some good clicks on their website. But that's okay. It's still cool to get some more detail about things we already knew about, and I'm sure we'll get more articles in the future. Moving over to the Mass Effect TV show, we found out, it was a couple months back where we got confirmation that Amazon is moving forward with the development of the show. I believe the director or something got confirmed. People weren't super excited about it, but things are happening. I guess that's good. The most recent news that just actually came out in the last couple days was that we got a possible plot synopsis from some documents people found, and it's Mass Effect 1. at least the first season of the show is very likely just going to be Mass Effect 1. Or at least a good chunk of it. I don't really know a point in that game that you could like cut it off for one season and then maybe the second half is the end of the game, or the second half is the second season. I don't know, but essentially it looks like it's going to be Commander Shepard collecting resources and companions to stop Saren in his work with the Reapers. That's literally exactly what it says. Some of the interesting bits is one of the more recently announced people who's going to be involved is the producer and writer Daniel Casey. It also had Mike Gamble on there as a like a director or producer or something, some fairly prominent role. That makes sense. Like if you looked at like the Fallout show has Todd Howard, The Last of Us has Neil Druckmann, it kind of makes sense. Now, Neil Druckmann is like extremely involved with the development of that show. I don't know if Todd or Gamble is going to be as involved. I suspect it's going to be more of a, advisor role, but we'll have to wait and see. But there were a lot of reactions to this. There's a lot of people who are mad that they're going to do this. There are a lot of people who want Mass Effect with this TV show to just do a kind of like what Fallout did, tell a new story with new characters and kind of intertwine it with the universe and the events that we know about from playing the games. And I don't disagree. I thought the Fallout show is probably my favorite game adaptation into a media like a film or TV show. I think the Fallout show hit the tone perfectly, and I thought it was interesting and really good. And I would understand why people would want that. I just think that at the end of the day, we just have more lore for Fallout that we've actually seen, whether it's in games or in media in general. It's just a bigger world. We've seen it span more time, where really our actual experience of the Mass Effect universe has been like relatively small. And so I think the idea of them just doing like a spin-off show that tells some story in the Mass Effect universe that maybe references things that we know or people we know, I mean, it would probably make existing fans happier. The same fans who are going to be mad if they don't do Mass Effect 1 like perfectly, or if they take any liberties with it. But I don't think it would serve the purpose of what the show is for, which we'll talk about in a minute. I personally just wish it wasn't going to be real, like a live action. I wish it was going to be animated personally. I think it would make way more sense because, especially if you're going to do Mass Effect 1, because if you did animated, you could have Mark Meer or Jennifer Hale, voice Commander Shepard, and good luck to them deciding if they're going to do male Shep or fem Shep. That's a thing for them to figure out. And you could have Brandon Keener voice Garrus. You could have all the proper people do all of their characters. But if you do live action, I mean, obviously, like I guess Brandon Keener could do Garrus because Garrus is almost certainly going to be an animated character. You could have all the aliens in theory be voiced by the proper people. But I don't know. My biggest issue is that it's live action. I don't actually. I think people wanted like the First Contact War. I mean, that would be cool. I don't disagree. But that would be for such a small segment of people. Like I think that you tell the story of Mass Effect, the first game. That's just going to be a more enticing thing for people, especially because it is a tie-in piece of media. They will make it. The purpose of it is to try to sell games and get interest in the franchise again. And that's why I was going to get to the purpose of this show. When I've seen people reacting to this, especially like other content creators and fans of Mass Effect, so much of that, you gotta like open up your mind. You have to ask yourself, why are they even making this show? It's not just going to be fan service. Like as much as that's what we want, people who are fans of the franchise already and have been for, literally decades, it's not going to be just for you, unfortunately. Like I know that's what you want. That's not what you're going to get. I can basically promise you that. This show is going to be to do a little fan service for sure, but it's also going to be to try to make this series relevant again. And if it does well, I bet they'll do shows for all three games, the first games. I don't expect to see an Andromeda show, but who knows? But it, like I said before, it's been, almost 20 years since Mass Effect 1 came out. It's been, 12, 13 plus years since Mass Effect 3 came out. It's been almost a decade since Andromeda came out. The franchise isn't very relevant. I think the Legendary Edition helped a lot, but it's what got me involved. But I think, and I suspect that EA and BioWare saw, or in hindsight, have seen what happened to Dragon Age, where it didn't have a game for 10 years. It really had very little motion and very little like transmedia and stuff like that for a decade. I know that they did like a Netflix animated show that I've heard was like kind of terrible. There was like a comic book. I know they did a like a podcast, like an audiobook thing that just won like some kind of award, so that's cool. But it just fell out of relevance, and there's lots of reasons why that game may not have sold the way they wanted it to. One of them was almost certainly because a lot of people probably don't know what Dragon Age is. So with and we'll talk more about it with some of these other things, but with doing the Legendary Edition, that was mostly probably just a play to make the franchise relevant again. Doing this TV show is certainly a play to get it, to get the series and the franchise known again by the average person. There's just today, it's on the 17th of June, they just started a crossover event with Battlefield 2042 where you can earn and buy a bunch of cosmetics in the Battlefield game that make your armor and guns look like things, and even a plane and one of the land vehicles look like Mass Effect things. That you do that stuff because it's relatively low effort and it's a way to just get it out there. I wouldn't be surprised at all. I can almost guarantee that in the next year or two, we'll have Commander Shepard, FemShep, and MShep, Garrus, Tally, Liara, probably the whole crew in Fortnite. I can almost guarantee we'll see them in Fortnite. And it's just going to be a way to try to, get conversation happening. The more times Mass Effect gets said, the words Mass Effect, between now and the release of the next game, the better for the game. And I think that was a problem for Dragon Age. And I think they tried to hold off on Dragon Age until the last minute, just because they, well, that's when it was done. But maybe to control the marketing or something, it obviously didn't work. So with Mass Effect, they're probably going to take a different strategy of talking about it constantly, having it always in people's minds, even if it's not the game. And I think this TV show goes a long way. I don't know when it's going to happen, and maybe it never happens. These things can't fall through. I will say I reached out to Daniel Casey, who is currently the producer and writer on this Mass Effect show for Amazon, who seemed extremely willing to come on and do an interview, either on this podcast or my main one, or maybe I'll just make it a whole separate video. I'm not sure, but just to have a heads up, I do have that that kind of lead out there, and it's really going to be up to him whenever he's allowed to talk and whenever he wants to. So be on the lookout for that. Eventually, I promise I will pump that up big when it eventually hopefully happens. Speaking of that Battlefield 2042 crossover, I messed with it. I was checking it out. I'm going to play a little bit of it today, possibly on stream. We'll have to wait and see. But it's cool. It's nothing groundbreaking. They didn't like, I was really hoping they would literally like introduce like the M8 as a weapon and some of that stuff. They're just skins. They're pretty significant skins on a bunch of the weapons to make them legit look like Mass Effect weapons. But they are just skins of other ones. The character models, there's a couple Commander Shepard ones and a Garrus skin that makes the armor look like theirs. It really brings up the ugly head of Battlefield 2042. Even though I love that game, one of the things I hate about it is like the operators that they have, and that the three armor cosmetics that you can use are only for these three characters, and I don't even like playing with two of them. So that's kind of a bummer. One of them I do like playing with, so I'll check that one out. But it's cool. One of the fighter aircraft you can make look a little bit like the Normandy. And then my favorite one is there's a infantry fighting vehicle, a wheeled one that it looks like the Mako. They basically gave it a cosmetic skin to look like the Mako, and it actually looks pretty good. So if you're a Battlefield fan, it's definitely worth checking out. You do have to pay for a majority of it. I had a bunch of coins left over from buying them like years ago at this point, so I use those. And there are a few items that you can unlock by just playing a special mode right now. So check that out. It's cool. It's nothing big, but like I was just talking about with the TV show, this is one of those things. We're going to see this. We're probably going to see them in Fortnite. We'll probably see them in other places. We've even seen them in No Man's Sky. They rerun that event fairly often where you can get the Normandy as a ship in that game, or at least interact with it. I can't remember. So just expect to see a lot more of this stuff. If it bothers you, man, that sucks because I suspect we're going to see a new strategy with this next Mass Effect game that's going to look very different than what we got from Dragon Age and some of their previous titles. Another game that isn't directly related, but I think it's definitely worth talking about is The Expanse Osiris Reborn. This was announced by, I believe it's Owlcat is the developer of it, and it just looks like a modern Mass Effect game. Obviously, it's set in the Expanse universe, which ironically, if you ever ask anyone, hey, I want to watch a show that is like Mass Effect, the main show people would say right now, because there is no real Mass Effect show yet, is The Expanse. So now there's The Expanse game coming that is literally just a modern Mass Effect game in all the best ways. Third person, cover shooter, action sci-fi game, grounded, has a very grounded aesthetic and everything. It has romance. It has a ship you can customize and fly, or at least direct. It's got choices that will be consequential. People can die, different endings, all this stuff. It's a Mass Effect game, and it's super cool. I've never really played any of their games, but everything I see people talk about the games that they have put out, it's like always very positive, and that makes me really excited for this. They've released a decent number of screenshots and some gameplay and stuff. It looks incredible. Like, it literally looks like what you would assume the next Mass Effect game is going to look like, at least in some capacity. If anything, I'm sure there's a little bit of side-eyeing happening there. But hopefully this can be kind of like a proof of concept and kind of a preview of what we may see in another 3 or 4 years from that game. So I'm really excited for it. I believe it's coming in 2026, but apparently they're going to do a beta, which is interesting for a single player game. I don't know why you need to do a beta necessarily, but I assume it'll basically act as a demo. But I'm on the lookout for that. I've seen a lot of people being like, yeah, The Expanse, Osiris Reborn, and Exodus, Mass Effect fans are feasting. I don't really have an Exodus topic here. I don't think Exodus is a real game. I'm sorry. Like, I'm sure it is. I'm sure they're just a small team and they have like a co-dev, and Hasbro isn't exactly like a big giant, like big game publisher or anything. But man, like, I get those emails, and if you're signed up for the Exodus, like Founders Club or whatever, I get the emails, and it's always like, here's some obscure, vague description of a new animal or a planet or something. Also, buy some of our merch. And like, they didn't announce anything during the Summer Game Fest time here. I don't think they did anything during the like Game Awards time last year. The big times, and like that's where they got like initially revealed. And then they do these like dev Q&As, and all they do is just talk about these big giant concepts they have for this game, and it just all feels so like, in theory they're multiple years into the full development of this game. We don't have a release date, but it's been speculated that it's within the next year or two, and they're talking about this game like they still haven't even decided what it is yet. We've seen essentially zero gameplay, no actual like models. I want Exodus to be a thing. I know it's got like Drew Karpashian and stuff like that. That's why everyone's saying, a bunch of other Mass Effect former devs, and that's why everyone's pumped about it. I'm just saying that I've been doing this stuff for a long time. I've been covering games for a long time, and like, we already know and have seen more from The Expanse Osiris Reborn than Exodus, despite Exodus getting announced like 2 years ago or something close to that. Like, that's weird to me. Like, that's strange. But maybe I'm just being too pessimistic. I have no idea. I just seeing a bunch of, especially other content creators who, cover similar things as me, just hype that game up so hard with almost zero reason to, outside of words and dreams. It just, there's a tendency in the content creation game to always be looking for the next big thing. So you can be the first one who hyped it. So you can, get in with the devs and stuff like that. And, you can be one of those like founding content creators, but that's a risky game because a lot of these games just don't work out, or they end up not being very good. And the first game from a new studio is always going to be interesting. And the kind of game they've described with Exodus sounds like a huge moonshot for the first game from a studio ever. Where with Owlcat, they've released a bunch of games, and really the scope and scale of this Expanse game doesn't really seem all that crazy. Seems very doable. So we'll have to wait and see what happens from both of them. But I think, especially with the Expanse, I feel like Mass Effect fans should be pretty pumped for that. Hopefully it's something that can hold us over for a couple years here. Moving over to some hiring updates. So we had the senior tech artist, which I think was being hired for when I did my last episode. It looks like it's been filled, or at least it's been taken down. I haven't seen anyone like announce that they've joined BioWare, but not everyone's on social media. Not everyone makes these big public displays of their new jobs. So be on the lookout for that. It seems like maybe they filled that role, which was up for quite a while. And then they, in May, I believe, posted a opening for a senior gameplay animator. This is kind of ironic because one of the people who was temporarily placed and then permanently placed back, at the beginning of the year, was someone who almost certainly was supposed to be their senior gameplay animator, because they've been an animator for all the biggest studios in the world. And now they've left EA because they got put on a different studio because they came to BioWare to work on Mass Effect. So if you know who that person is, I'm sure you'll know who I'm talking about. But they're gone. They left EA entirely. They're with another studio now, and it was probably a good move for them. So they're looking for that, and that's why that move was so tough, man. That to move all those people off, because now they're going to start trying to rehire those positions, and I'm sure they're going to try to get people back who want to come back, who were just with them, a year ago. But not everyone's going to wait, and a lot of people are going to feel scorned, and so you're going to have to find brand new people. So we'll see how that plays out. I'll keep an eye on it. I'm anticipating if they're going to make like a full production announcement later this year, that we'll see a pretty big jump in hiring sooner than later, because they'll have to get people prepped and ready for that. And I have to imagine that's coming sooner than later, or at least I hope. And then finally, the way I kind of end all these episodes is with my N7-day predictions. Like I said, we haven't really gotten anything big this year besides directly from BioWare, at least, besides the blog. I think it was in like March from Gary McKay, where he talked about like it was supposed to be this like, hey, we're focused on Mass Effect now. That's our next game. And we're doing pre-production. We're super pumped. And then they kind of like muffled and like turned their head and like, oh, and by the way, those people that we put on other teams, they're now there permanently. And we may have laid some people off. It sucks. It blows. It's not good news. I think it makes sense, the things they're doing, considering what they're trying to do. Essentially, it seems to save BioWare or keep it viable instead of just shutting it down, which they easily could have. Some people would argue they should have. Not me, though. As for the rest of this year before N7 Day, I don't know. I mean, I guess in theory, we could get a blog at any time. Good Lord, I hope it's not from Gary McKay, because that's always bad news. But I would love to see a blog from Mike Gamble saying, hey, no huge announcements yet. Hold tight for N7 Day. But we are still in pre-production. We're hiring up. Here's some of the new people on the team. And, maybe get crazy. Maybe throw us some concept art. Because right now, there should be books full of concept art floating around their studio of, things that they're thinking about, the story, doing all that stuff. Show us some stuff. Don't make us wait till N7 Day, but we probably will. As for N7 Day, I will I'll make the bold prediction. It will probably be our quote unquote like biggest in 7 day that we've had at least since 2020 when they announced the next game. I still don't expect it to be like, I don't expect to have like a subtitle. I don't expect to have a release date. I don't expect to have, even probably not even like a protagonist, antagonist, setting, even time frame. They probably won't confirm, right? I suspect they'll have another trailer like they did in 2023. They'll have probably some art, some things that are supposed to make us think and trick us and make us wonder when this takes place and who's in it and all that crap. But I'm not expecting like the mother load yet, where we find out what the game is called and who's going to be in it. And, because at this point we still only know that Liara's voice actress is supposed to be in it. Who knows? Now, in theory, there's a few months until then. The voice actors are no longer withholding work. So if they wanted to do a trailer that had Liara's voice in it, maybe other people's, they could probably fire something like that up before then. But we're just gonna have to wait and see. I think, assuming they announce full production this year, then you would fully expect, in 7 day and even just the general, general updates, in 26, 27 and leading up to release would be obviously much bigger deals. But I think we're gonna have to wait for that, unfortunately. And that's where I'm gonna start wrapping it up. This was a fun little episode to record, a little bit more than I thought we were going to have. So thank you for listening. These episodes will pick up once we start getting more info. I know right now I just do one every few months. I mean, it's basically just I'm going to make as many episodes as there are things to talk about. So when we start getting big info drops and when big things start happening and all that, I could in theory record an episode every week. I would say monthly is much more likely as we kind of get towards, production and, release dates and things like that, and hopefully with guests and things like that. So keep an eye out. But I do appreciate you listening to this one. Subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app, leave a review on Spotify or iTunes, and subscribe to the Bond Diesel YouTube channel to get all of my videos, including this podcast. Thank you to everyone who supports as YouTube members and Twitch subscribers. If you're interested in supporting this podcast and all of my other content, please check out the links in the show description. If you have any questions or feedback, comment on Spotify or YouTube. Let me know in my Discord or hit me up on social media at Bondiesel or at the Mass Effect HYPEcast. That is all I have for this episode of the Mass Effect HYPEcast. So until next time.